Welcome everyone to this year's Pufendorf lectures. A distinguished forum named in recognition of Samuel von Pufendorf, whose work laid foundational stones for modern thought on natural law, society, and human reason. For those of you who don't know me or just hear a disembodied voice over Zoom, my name is Martin Hanson, the head of the department, of the philosophy department at the university. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Robert Brandom, distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, as this year's speaker for the Pufendorf lecture. Professor Brandom is one of the most influential, likely the most now living pragmatists, and one of the world's most highly regarded now living philosophers of language. Although his contributions to philosophy spans many areas, including epistemology, philosophy of mind, logic, and the history of philosophy, many, including myself, know him primarily through his philosophy of language. In particular, his impressive, even daunting work on putting together ideas from Wittgenstein and Wilfrid Sellars on the idea of meaning as use. In his seminal book, Making It Explicit, from 1994, he made one variant of this idea, as befits the title of the book, very explicit. On Professor Brandom's account, the meaning of an expression should be understood in terms of the norms governing its use for making inferences. A fruitful idea with many interesting consequences, some of which have been developed in Professor Brandom's rich body of work, and some of which I believe will be discussed in the Pufendorf lectures soon to begin. Before I hand over to Professor Brandom, I want to mention some practicalities. Today's lecture is the first of 3 lectures. They will all be given on the same time, 3:15 to 5, and on the same Zoom link, bearing unforeseen technical difficulties. All 3 lectures will be recorded and be made available on the Pufendorf website. You can also go back and find handouts and abstracts for the lectures there. For people joining from other places, you can find the handout for this lecture in the chat. The lectures will be about an hour long, after which there will be a Q&A. People in attendance here in Lund will be prioritized, but I'm hoping that there will be some time for people to ask questions, even if they attend remotely. If you're connecting via Zoom and have a question, please write it in the Zoom chat. And my colleague Frederick will turn on your audio so you may post it at the appropriate time. Please state your questions succinctly, as there may be others waiting their turn. And note that since the questions will be recorded as well, please do not post one if you do not want to be recorded. Okay, without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Robert Brandom, this year's Pufendorf lecture.
Well, thank you so much. When I say that cats are mammals, we can distinguish what I've said, something sayable, namely that cats are mammals, from my saying of it, something that I've done, a speech act I've performed. Of course, this ing-ed structure of doing and thing done, act and object acted on, is a common linguistic construction. We distinguish breakings from what's broken, sortings from what's sorted, and drinkings from what's drunk. In the special case of discursive doings, such as sayings and thinkings, the object said or thought is of a special kind. What can in the central sense be said or thought is conceptual, more specifically propositional contents. Such contents are the subject of a special intellectual discipline, semantics. The semantic tradition that runs from Frege through the early Wittgenstein, Carnap, Tarski, and Quine to Kripke, David Lewis, and Kit Fine, among many others, deploys a constellation of expressively powerful technical vocabularies for specifying, relating, and combining various kinds of meanings or conceptual contents. It addresses, to begin with, the meanings of logical and mathematical locutions, and those of other artificial languages. But the tradition extends from there, both actually and aspirationally, to encompass the contents of a wide range of kinds of linguistic expressions found in natural languages. We can reasonably hope to deploy the metaconceptual resources of semantic theory to explain the difference between discursive contents, which can be said or thought or meant, and things that can merely be broken, sorted, drunk, or the like. What about the practical ing side of discursive doings? This is the force side of Frege's force-content distinction, whose paradigm is the assertional force distinctive of saying something in the sense of making a statement or a claim. Broadening usage a bit, we can call the study of this practical dimension of discursive activity pragmatics. The idea is that pragmatics studies the use of linguistic expressions and semantics studies their meanings, to put things in a Wittgensteinian sort of way. Rough as it is, this characterization already invites us to think about the obligations each of these theoretical enterprises, semantic and pragmatic, owes to each other. In saying things, we're doing something sufficiently different from non-discursive doings, such as breaking, dropping, and drinking, that what is said admits of specifically semantic interpretation as having meaning or conceptual, specifically propositional content, in a sense in which what's broken, dropped, or drunk does not. So it's a minimal criterion of adequacy on a pragmatic theory that it account for this difference. What is it about the discursive practice that establishes the crucial connection between assertional speech acts and the propositional contents they express? There is nothing, I think, except the use of declarative sentences to confer propositional content on them. The semantic interpretability of sentences must be intelligible in broadly functional terms of the roles such linguistic expressions play in discursive practice. Along this dimension, pragmatics must answer to semantics. For an adequate pragmatic theory must underwrite an account of how the relation between sentential expressions and the semantic interpretants assigned to them by some semantic theory is fixed. I'll call this the conferral condition. Pragmatics owes an account of how use, however use is construed, confers meaning as understood by some semantic theory. Conversely, there's also a sense in which semantics answers to pragmatics. Formal semantics can be thought of as having only the restricted task of showing how to compute the semantic interpretants of complex expressions based on stipulated associations of semantic interpretants with simple expressions. But the point of associating sayable meanings or semantic interpretants with expressions at all is ultimately to make sense of what speakers are doing in using those expressions. Appeal to the meanings or contents of speech acts must help explain what practitioners are doing in saying something by producing those discursive performances. I'll call this the codification condition. Semantics owes an account of how the meanings of expressions explain or constrain their use. One model of how this condition might be satisfied understands the features of use to be explained by associating semantic interpretants with expressions as dispositions of and behavioral regularities exhibited by language users, described in a spare naturalistic vocabulary. Meanings are then thought of as theoretical entities, postulated to explain observable patterns of discursive behavior. From this point of view, Dummett's insistence that the coordinate character of the concepts of meaning and understanding entails that semantic properties must be analyzable without remainder into features of use, that Dummettian claim, shows up as a kind of semantic instrumentalism. For it, in effect, rejects postulating theoretical entities and explaining linguistic behavior. And Wittgenstein's wholesale rejection of the concept of meaning in favor of the concept of use shows up as a consequence of his conviction that philosophy is not one of the natural sciences. once the postulation of unobservables to explain the antics of observables is identified as the core of natural scientific methodology. I don't think this model will help us understand what's distinctive about the specifically discursive form of the act-content distinction. That is, what distinguishes sayables and thinkables from breakables, sortables, and drinkables. For that, we must think of meanings as codifying norms, governing the use of expressions that have those meanings. We should understand what the semantic theorist is doing in associating a certain meaning or semantic interpretant with an expression as undertaking a commitment regarding how it would be correct or proper to use the expression in question. The immediate consequence of specifying the truth conditions of a declarative sentence, for instance, is to set a standard of appraisal or assessment of the correctness or propriety of assertions of that sentence in a distinctively semantic sense of correct or appropriate. The usefulness of the semantic characterizations of discursive performances in explaining dispositions or regularities of behavior of users of that sentence is indirect, mediated by the use governing norms that those semantic attributions codify. I've gestured in the direction of an important dimension along which pragmatics answers to semantics. It's a criterion of adequacy on an account of the use of the language that it show how such use serves to confer meaning on linguistic expressions, establishing the association of some sort of propositional contents, as construed by the semantics, with the sentences of the language. And I've also gestured in the direction of an important dimension along which semantics answers to pragmatics. It's a criterion of adequacy on an account of the meanings of linguistic expressions that show how meanings codify or determine norms governing the use of those expressions. Paradigmatically, the use of declarative sentences to make claims or assertions. Because we have so much better worked out formal semantic theories of meaning than we do metasemantic pragmatic theories of use, it's worth thinking of the conferral condition and the codification condition as criteria of adequacy really for pragmatics in the very broad sense in which I'm using the term. Together, they require that an adequate pragmatic theory must characterize the use of the language in such a way as to show how, so specified, discursive practices are intelligible as conferring meanings or conceptual contents on linguistic expressions, paradigmatically conferring propositional content on declarative sentences, such that those contents or meanings are intelligible as setting normative standards for the appraisal of the correctness of linguistic moves. In the abstract, I think it's difficult to say what a pragmatics that met those conditions might look like. So I'm going to start by sketching a minimal discursive practice, specifying it in a simple, regimented, pragmatic metavocabulary. Then I'll introduce Kit Fine's truthmaker semantic theory and show how it can be understood to be so related to the pragmatic theory that the twin requirements are satisfied. What practitioners do in talking, according to the pragmatic theory, both suffices to connect the expressions used to Finean semantic interpretants and explains how those interpretants set normative standards for the assessment of the correctness of speech acts that use those expressions. This is the first large move in a narrative arc that will lead in my third lecture to a novel account of the rational functional role that confers propositional conceptual content on declarative sentences. Discursive practices, in the sense I'm focusing on, are those that enable practitioners to claim that things are thus and so. These are acts of claiming, both asserting and denying, which address specifically propositional contents. I begin by considering a distinctive kind of contrast between act and content, the ing-ed distinction. The distinction between saying, a speech act or discursive performance, and what's said, a content or meaning. That's where I started. Specifying the sense of saying that's in play here is claiming, stating, saying, or denying that things are thus and so. That's our first step in outlining a pragmatic theory. Linguistic expressions that can be uttered with that kind of force, asserting or denying, expressing attitudes of accepting or rejecting, and that kind of content, propositional, are thereby functioning as declarative sentences. That's why it's declarative sentences that are both uttered in speech acts of asserting or denying and used to form the that clauses specifying the propositional contents asserted or denied. So we could, to begin with, functionally define declarative sentences as linguistic expressions whose freestanding utterance has the basic default pragmatic force or significance of claimings, paradigmatically, assertions. Is there a corresponding functional definition of that assertional force or pragmatic significance? The orienting idea that I'll pursue is that there is an internal conceptual relationship between claiming and reasoning. Asserting and denying are activities that take place in what my hero Wilfrid Sellars calls the space of reasons, of justifying and being able to justify what one says. Discursive practices, in the sense of practices that accord some performances the practical significance of assertions or denials, are essentially, and not just accidentally, practices of giving and asking for reasons. Making claims is part of a package of activities that includes rationally challenging claims by making further claims that contest them by offering reasons against them, and rationally defending claims by making further claims that justify them by offering reasons for them. Of course, not every claiming need be challenged or defended, but that claims are liable to challenges that bring with them justificatory obligations is a core feature of the genus of asserting. Sellars offers the following historical metaconceptual context for this line of thought. He says, quote, Kant was on the right track when he insisted that just as concepts are essentially, and not accidentally, items which can occur in judgments, so judgments, and thereby indirectly concepts, are essentially, and not accidentally, items which can occur in reasonings or arguments. End of the quote. It's essential to assertings, including covert acts of judgings, that they can both serve as and stand in need of reasons, can play the role both of premise and of conclusion in inferences. In fact, Sellars draws and attributes to Kant semantic consequences from this holist, functionalist, pragmatic order of explanation. Thinking of saying that things are thus and so as descriptive uses of expressions, he also says, quote, it's only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate these objects in a space of implications that they describe at all rather than merely label. End of the quote. What he's disparaging as mere labeling is a matter of an expression having determinate circumstances of appropriate application, so that its proper production reliably differentially classifies what's being responded to. The surplus need for genuine conceptual contentfulness, whose paradigm is propositional contentfulness, Sellars is claiming, is situation in a space of implications that determines also the appropriate consequences of application of the expression. That is, what follows from the applicability of the concept. The suggestion is that propositions must be individuated at least as finely as the roles they play in what Sellars calls a space of implications. Now, I take these functionalist, specifically inferentialist ideas to be right-headed and helpful. But in thinking about the relations between pragmatic claims about assertional force, what one's doing in saying that things are, describing things as thus and so, and semantic claims about propositional conceptual content, it behooves us to be clear and careful both about the distinction and the relations between inferential moves and doings, justifying and challenging, on the pragmatic side of understanding the assertional force in terms of practices of reasoning, on the one hand, and implication relations on the semantic side of understanding propositional contents in terms of such relations, on the other hand. A famous argument due to my teacher Gilbert Harman highlights some crucial considerations. Harman provocatively claims that there is no such thing as deductive inference. If there were, he argues, surely a paradigmatic instance would be inferring from P and the conditional if P then Q to the consequent Q. But he points out, thought of as a rule for doing something, in the sense of a general policy for belief revision, that would be a bad policy. For one might well have far better reasons or evidence against Q than one had for either P or the conditional. And in that case, one should surely not inferentially draw the conclusion Q from one's commitment to P and if P then Q. One should rather revise or reject one of those premises. Harman's conclusion is that deductive logic determines implication relations, but that those implications do not determine, but only constrain proper inferential practices. We can put the point by saying that the fact that P and if P then Q imply Q means that it's inappropriate or incorrect to assert P and if P then Q and to deny Q. But if we find ourselves with good reasons for all those attitudes, the implication relations don't tell us what to do inferentially to repair that discordant constellation of doxastic commitments. The implication relations among them don't settle what conclusion should be drawn, what assertional stance should be the outcome of an inferential move. Taking on Harman's distinction between reason relations of implication or consequence between propositional contents and reasoning practices of justifying and challenging assertions, responding assertionally to such justifications and challenges, puts us in a position to indicate the contours of a minimal model of discursive practice that can meet the dual basic criteria of adequacy of an account of the relations between pragmatic theory and semantic theory. These requirements are that it explain both how engaging in practices of making claims and reasoning about them by inferentially justifying and challenging them can confer conceptual, paradigmatically propositional content on assertable linguistic expressions, and how such contents can provide normative standards for assessments of the correctness of assertional and inferential performances. These are what I earlier called the conferral condition and the codification condition on the relations between pragmatics and semantics. The model is minimal in that all it aims to do is characterize sufficient conditions on a practice for it to be a discursive practice. Conditions, that is, that are necessary and sufficient for some performances to be accorded the practical significance of claimings. That requires understanding what is asserted by those acts of asserting or denied by those acts of denying, utterings of what thereby count as declarative sentences, to be propositional contents, which are claimables, claimed in claimings of the two kinds. Propositional contents are to be understood as what can both serve as and stand in need of reasons. Two principal criteria of adequacy are then that the minimal model of discursive practice make intelligible how engaging in that practice confers propositional contents, and how those propositional contents serve to normatively constrain the practice in the sense of setting standards for assessment of the correctness of the claimings, including those that play the role of justifying or challenging other claimings. The concrete idea for understanding the connections between implication relations and norms governing reasoning practices that I'm going to pursue comes from the bilateral normative pragmatics of the consequence relations expressed by sequent calculus turnstiles developed by Greg Restall and David Ripley. Put in my terms, they start with the idea of the bipolarity of doxastic attitudes. This is taking those attitudes to come in two essentially contrasting flavors, acceptance and rejection. We can think of them as coordinate with the two flavors of the speech acts that express them, assertion and denial. Implication relations between a set of premises and a conclusion Restall and Ripley say, can then be understood in normative terms of assessment of the correctness or propriety of constellations of doxastic attitudes of the two kinds. In particular, for the premise set of sentences gamma to imply conclusion sentence A is for the overall position any speaker would be in if they accepted all the claims in gamma and rejected A to be normatively out of bounds in Restall and Ripley's normative idiom. The two sides implicitly invoked in calling this definition bilateral, that's their term, are the two sides of the turnstile expressing an implication, which it proposes to treat differently with respect to the fundamental doxastic bipolarity of acceptance and rejection. For bilateralism understands the significance for reason relations of what happens on the left-hand premise side in terms of doxastic acceptance, and the significance for reason relations of what appears on the right or conclusion side of the implication turnstile is understood in terms of doxastic rejection. Restall and Ripley offer a definition of the central reason relation of implication that's couched in an avowedly normative, pragmatic metalanguage. They're explicit about the normative character of the crucial concept of being out of bounds, which entails incorrectness, some kind of negative ought to be. Our purposes will be served by offering a friendly amendment to the Restall-Ripley account. For I take it that their notion of a position, which is what's subject to normative assessment as in or out of bounds, is itself already implicitly a normative notion. What's assessed is attitudes of acceptance or rejection, ultimately of propositions, and those can usefully be thought of as the two basic kinds of doxastic commitment. Their notion of a position is then itself a constellation of normative statuses or attitudes, divided into commitments to accept and commitments to reject. For a set of premises gamma to imply a conclusion A, a matter of reason relations, is then for the set of commitments to accept everything in gamma and to reject A to be one to which a constellation to which one cannot be jointly entitled. Their notion of out of boundness I'm reading as preclusion of entitlement to all of a set of commitments. Here it's worth noticing for future reference that the notion of doxastic commitment, whether to accept or reject, is an atomistic one. A speech act of assertion or denial can add a commitment to a position independently of what that position already contains. But entitlement is a holistic matter. It's assessed for whole positions, where entitlement to any one commitment depends on what else one is committed to. But in these terms, we can offer a rough characterization of the relation between rational implication relations and reasoning practices, which respects Harman's insight. Speech acts of claiming, like the doxastic commitments they express, must come in two flavors: assertions, expressing doxastic acceptance commitments, and denials, expressing doxastic rejection commitments. Basic reasoning practices govern two kinds of pragmatic significance that some claimings can have relative to others: challenging a claim by offering reasons against it, and justifying a claim by offering reasons for it. The idea is that successfully challenging a claim voids the default entitlement that doxastic commitments can be thought of as coming with, and successfully justifying a claim reinstates its status as a commitment entitlement to which is not precluded. Well, how then do reason relations, paradigmatically implication, figure in the doxastic practices of this model? The idea is that the pragmatic notion of the set of claimables gamma being a reason for the claim A appeals to the implication of A by gamma, the relation that holds when commitment to accept all of gamma precludes entitlement to deny A, according to the doxastic practices of the community. Of course, as Harman would point out, whether offering gamma as a reason for A succeeds depends also, for instance, on one's entitlement to the premises in gamma. What about reasons against? The critical dimension of rational practice, as opposed to the justificatory dimension, is articulated by another kind of reason relation, incompatibility. In the spirit of Restall's bilateral definition of the reason relation of implication, we can say that to give a reason against A is to make claims, gamma, acceptance of which precludes entitlement to accept A. There must be two basic kinds of reason relation, implication and incompatibility, because practices of reasoning require claims standing to one another, both in the relation of being a reason for and in the relation of being a reason against. In the most basic case, there are reasons to accept and reasons to reject. We can take it that if gamma implies A, in the sense that commitment to accept all of gamma precludes entitlement to reject A, then gamma thereby implicitly provides reasons to accept A, since one has been precluded from being entitled to the only alternative commitment. Similarly, if gamma is incompatible with A, in the sense that commitment to all of gamma precludes entitlement to accept A, then gamma implicitly provides reasons to reject A, since one has been precluded by one's commitment to gamma from being entitled to the only alternative commitment. The paired reason relations of implication and incompatibility accordingly articulate the pragmatic significance of being a reason for or being a reason against, which is an essential aspect of the fundamental bipolarity of acceptance and rejection. This is the same bipolarity that's expressed in a semantic metalanguage by the opposition of true and false. These expressions of the basic bipolarity in the two idioms, pragmatic and semantic, are connected by the principle that acceptance is practically taking true, and rejection is practically taking false. One of my principal aims in this lecture is to show that and how this platitude, that accepting is taking true and rejecting is taking false, how that platitude can be deepened substantially by focusing on the manifestation of the fundamental bipolarity at the level of reason relations among claimables rather than properties of the claimables, whether the semantic property of being true and false or the pragmatic property of being accepted or rejected by some interlocutor. I want us to raise up a level from thinking about properties of sentences, whether pragmatic or semantic, to thinking about the reason relations among them. Reason relations of implication and incompatibility show up in this normative pragmatic model as systematic preclusions of entitlement to some constellations of doxastic commitments. So understood, reason relations give us a grip on the claimable propositional contents that stand in such relations. We can understand those semantic contents as the roles sentences expressing them play in structures of reason relations, both what they imply and what implies them, and what they're incompatible with. For these determine what's a reason for and against what, and so what speech acts of challenging and defending claims count as successful in altering which doxastic commitments various interlocutors are entitled to. In my third lecture, I'll present a formal conceptual role semantics based on this idea of propositional contents as roles with respect to reason relations. For now, it's enough to observe that the idea of propositional contents as standing in relations of implication and incompatibility, as defined in the bilateral normative pragmatic vocabulary, points in the direction of how the paired criteria of adequacy I called the conferral condition and the codification condition can be satisfied. This minimal model that I've sketched of discursive practice shows how the use of declarative sentences by discursive practitioners can determine the reason relations that the claimables expressed by those sentences stand into one another. The key question is which constellation of acceptances and rejections preclude entitlement to which others, according to the way the practitioners keep track of entitlements in response to various claimings that they take or treat as reasons for or against others. Following the lead of Restall and Ripley's bilateral normative pragmatic definition of the reason relation of implication, We specify claiming and reason-giving practices in a richly normative meta-language of commitments and preclusions to entitlement. Their example shows how we can explain what reason relations are in such normative terms. By treating some claims as reasons for and against others, in the sense of what assertions and denials they count as challenges to and justifications or defenses of what others, practitioners institute reason relations among claimables, and so confer the kind of conceptual propositional content that's articulated by the role claimables play in that constellation of reason relations. The model of the role-reason relations of implication and incompatibility play in practices of making claims and rationally challenging and defending them with reasons also explains how the reason relations we're thinking of as articulating propositional contents can be understood as providing normative standards for assessment of the correctness of linguistic performances. The pragmatic idea of rational challenges to claims as consisting in undertaking commitments that provide reasons against those claims in the sense of being incompatible with them, and of rational defenses or justifications of claims as consisting in undertaking commitments that provide reasons for those claims, together show how what actually implies and is incompatible with what determines which challenges to or defenses of claims are successful in altering their entitlement status. The reason relations accordingly codify norms governing the making, challenging, and justifying of the propositionally contentful claims undertaken by assertions and denials. Harman offered convincing reasons to distinguish rational relations of implication and, by extension, incompatibility, and practices of giving and asking for reasons. I've suggested that a lightly tweaked version of Restall and Ripley's bilateral normative pragmatic definition of implication can be used to explain the relations between the two dimensions that Harman distinguishes. By explaining in normative pragmatic terms what reason relations of implication and incompatibility are, the bilateral account opens the way to an understanding of how sayables, in the sense of claimables, are related to sayings, in the sense of claimings. For we can appeal to the prospect of understanding those propositional claimables in terms of their role in reason relations. The concept of reason relations, which the bilateral normative pragmatic account of implication has clarified, brings into view another concept, which in one way or another will be the topic of the rest of these lectures. That's the concept of a vocabulary. I'll use that term in a technical sense to refer to a certain kind of algebraic relational structure. By a vocabulary, I mean an ordered pair, L and I, whose first element is a domain of sentences, which we can call a lexicon, and whose second element is a specification of the reason relations of implication and incompatibility holding between the elements of the lexicon. More specifically, for reasons that will emerge later on, the reason relations are going to be represented by a set of ordered pairs of sets of sentences from the lexicon. For a pair of sets of sentences to be included in the reason relations of a vocabulary means that the implication whose premises are the sentences in the first element of the ordered pair of sentences and whose conclusions are the sentences included in the second element of that pair is a good implication. I take it that the amended bilateral definitions of implication and incompatibility tell us in a deontically two-sorted, because it keeps track of commitment and entitlement, normative pragmatic meta-language, what it is in broad outlines for a linguistic community to use a vocabulary in that technical sense. It's for their practices of making, challenging, and defending claims expressed by sentences of the lexicon of the vocabulary to be normatively governed by the reason relations of that vocabulary. The vocabulary articulates the claimables, sentences playing roles with respect to reason relations, whose use in claimings the minimal model of discursive practice explicates. What we've seen so far is a sketch of how vocabularies look from the point of view of pragmatics, both how the vocabulary can be elaborated from what discursive practitioners do, according to the minimal model, as expressed in a relatively rich normative pragmatic metalanguage, and how the vocabulary can be understood as providing a normative standard for assessments of the correctness of discursive practices, discursive performances of claiming and challenging and defending claims. I turn next to consider how vocabularies, in this regimented sense of a lexicon plus a set of reason relations defined on that lexicon, look from a more orthodox semantic point of view. I take it that the most sophisticated and expressively powerful contemporary representational formal semantic framework is Kit Fine's Truthmaker semantics. It begins with a metaphysical picture of what there is to be represented semantically. That universe consists of a structured collection of what he calls states. The formal apparatus is as non-committal as possible about what those states consist in. But states are meant to include things such such ways things could be as Pittsburgh's being to the west of New York City and snow being white. The universe of states is thought of as having two sorts of structure, mereological and modal. On the mereological side, some states are to be understood as being parts of others. More formally, there's a fusion operation that maps any set of states into the whole comprising them. This defines the part-whole relation. State A is part of state B, in case B is the result of fusing A with some other states. On the modal side, the universe of states is partitioned into possible and impossible states. Mereologically and modally structured state spaces generalize the metaphysics of possible worlds along a number of important dimensions. Possible worlds show up in this framework as maximal possible states. That is, a possible world is a possible state such that every other state is either part of that state or incompatible with it, in the sense that fusing it with the world state yields an impossible state. So we can reconstruct possible worlds in Truthmaker semantics. Situation semantics had already shown the expressive advantages of building such wholes, possible worlds, out of smaller parts, rather than getting the partial ones by analyzing whole worlds. On the modal side, state spaces in general include multiple impossible states, where the possible world setting in effect only has one. On the mereological side, various structural conditions can be put on the fusion operation, for instance, requiring that all the states that contain any impossible state are themselves impossible. That is, that the result of fusing any state with an impossible state is always an impossible state. Like the existence of multiple impossible states, the capacity to consider different kinds of mereological structures is a major degree of theoretical freedom in the apparatus, which enhances the expressive power of the Truthmaker framework. This metaphysical specification of what there is to be represented is then married to a flexible and powerful semantics. An interpretation function assigns each declarative sentence to a pair of sets of states, thought of as the exact truth makers and the exact false makers of that sentence. Rather than simply defining one of these sets in terms of the others, one can put various explicit structural constraints on the sets of verifiers and falsifiers that are assigned to declarative sentences as their semantic interpretants. One might be tempted to require that the truth makers and falsity makers be disjoint. That is, that no possible state is both a truth maker and a falsity maker of any sentence. Fine interestingly requires rather that the fusion of any truth maker with any false maker of the same sentence must be an impossible state. He calls this condition exclusivity. It entails the cognate but usefully different requirement that any states that are both truth makers and false makers of the same sentence are impossible states. Some statements, say all cows are made of glass, or this photon has a mass of 500 kilograms, might have only impossible truth makers. But they're not required to have the same impossible states as their truth makers. The combination of the mereological and modal fineness of grain of the underlying metaphysics and keeping separate books on the truth makers and falsity makers that semantically interpret sentences results in a hyper-intentional theory of meaning, which makes many more distinctions than its possible world's predecessor. Together, Fine's modal mereological metaphysics and truthmaker semantics underwrite a striking realism about the propositional contents expressed by declarative sentences. For Fine, such propositional contents are just pairs of sets of states that meet whatever structural conditions we impose on such pairs to make them eligible to serve as truth makers and false makers of sentences. Paradigmatically, exclusivity, which requires that all fusions of elements of the first set with elements of the second set be impossible states. A proposition for Fine is any pair of sets of states that meets that condition of exclusivity, since it's eligible to serve as the interpretant of a sentence. However, even in the metaphysically implausible case where there's only a countable infinite number of states, there'll be uncountably many pairs of sets of them meeting the minimal structural condition for propositionality. And so far more propositions than any natural or formal language in the ordinary sense can have sentences to express. Further, those worldly propositions, understood as set theoretic and mereological constellations of possible and impossible states, stand to one another in relations of consequence and incompatibility. Fine offers two principal ways one might define consequence and counts it as a virtue of the system that he has multiple alternatives here. He says that a set of sentences gamma entails a conclusion A in case every verifier, truth maker, of all the premises in gamma is also a verifier of A. He says that A is a consequence of gamma in the different sense of containment, if and only if every verifier of A includes as a part a verifier of all of gamma, and every verifier of all of gamma is a part of a verifier of A. The details don't matter. Corresponding definitions of incompatibility are not far to seek. Here, I want to offer a friendly amendment. We might notice to begin with that Fine's definitions of consequence relations don't make anything like full use of mereological and the modal innovations that principally distinguish his framework from the possible world semantics it develops from and improves upon. Taking it that premise set gamma entails conclusion A, just in case all the verifiers of all of gamma are verifiers of A, just translates the set theoretic inclusion criterion of consequence from the possible world setting without adding anything of substance to it. In possible worlds, if the set of possible worlds that's one proposition is included in the set of possible worlds that's another proposition, then the one entails the other. He's just translated that condition. His notion of containment does exploit the mereological structure of his metaphysics, but not the modal structure of it. My colleague, collaborator, and co-author, Ulf Lobel, shows us how to do better in this setting. We can take our cue from Fine's exclusivity condition relating verifiers and falsifiers of the same sentence, so of the same proposition. It requires that every fusion of any verifiers and any falsifiers be an impossible state. Here's Lobel's suggestion, that we take gamma to imply A, just in case every fusion of any verifiers of all of the premises gamma with any falsifier of A is an impossible state. Exclusivity of verifiers and falsifiers is then manifested as reflexivity of the consequence relation. That is, the principle that every premise implies itself, every sentence implies itself in the Lobel sense, just follows from the exclusivity condition of Fine. Like exclusivity, this definition of a notion of consequence appeals both to the mereological and the modal structure of the universe of states from which the semantic interpretants of the sentences are drawn. The corresponding notion of incompatibility will require that the fusion of any verifiers of all of gamma with any verifier of A be an impossible state. The key point now is that this semantic definition of implication lines up perfectly with the bilateral pragmatic definition of implication. Mm-hmm. Can I? So the key point is that this semantic definition of implication lines up perfectly with the bilateral. Oh, sorry, I did not manage that, did I? There's where I want to be. Hloebel's version of the consequence implication in truthmaker semantics is gamma implies A if and only if any fusion of a state that verifies all the members of gamma with a state that falsifies A is an impossible state. The Restall-Ripley normative pragmatic reading of implication is that gamma implies A if and only if any position that includes accepting all of gamma and rejecting A is normatively incoherent or out of bounds. As we've read it, one cannot be entitled to such a constellation of commitments. Indeed, Hloebel proves that with these definitions, the reason relations defined semantically in Fine's truthmaker setting can be isomorphic with those defined pragmatically in the bilateral normative setting. This isomorphism is the result I've been building up to in this lecture so far. It points to a structure that's common to or amphibious between a pragmatic account of what one's doing in saying or claiming that things are thus and so, on the one hand, and a semantic account of the sayable or claimable propositions that are said or claimed, on the other hand. For both on the pragmatic side of speech acts and the semantic side of conceptual contents, the isomorphism reveals reason relations, bivalently distinguished into relations of implication and incompatibility. And the isomorphism shows that the very same reason relations can be understood as both defining reasons for and against, suitable for underwriting practical defenses of and challenges to doxastic commitments, and also as defining relations among Finean worldly propositions. The common topic, what I'm calling reason relations, earns the right to be called reason relations in virtue of its role in a pragmatic account of reasoning practices. Those include not only rationally challenging and defending commitments by giving reasons for and against them, by making further claims that stand to them in relations of incompatibility and implication, but also inferring in the sense of explicitly acknowledging an implicit commitment by accepting what one is precluded from entitlement to deny or denying what one is precluded from entitlement to accept. Hloebel's isomorphism articulates a precise sense in which those very same abstract reason relations can be discerned in the relations among worldly propositions, understood according to fine semantics and the modal mereological metaphysics of objective reality on which the truthmaker semantics is based. The pragmatic and semantic theories I've sketched, Restall and Ripley on the one hand and Kit Fine on the other, offer substantive specifications, explanations, and accounts of relations of implication and incompatibility. But they're very different accounts. Our version of the bilateral pragmatic account of the use of sentences is in terms of normative statuses of commitment and entitlement, and practical doxastic attitudes of acceptance and rejection. It tells us what it is for a discursive community practically to take or treat various implication and incompatibility relations as holding, by implicitly acknowledging them as norms governing their practices of making claims and challenging and defending them with reasons. This pragmatic account of the subjective appearance of reason relations is structurally mirrored by a semantic account of the objective metaphysical realities, couched in terms of the alethic impossibility of certain mereologically fused states that determine what propositions in fact follow from and are incompatible with which others. The isomorphism proves that the two metalinguistic accounts can offer perspectives on a single common, more abstract structure of implication and incompatibility. So the isomorphism between these two ways of specifying reason relations precisely defines and determines their common topic, the relations of implication and incompatibility that were informally introduced by Harman's argument. Astonishingly, it allows us to see that and how those reason relations articulate a structure common to assertional force and propositional content. I introduced the term vocabulary to refer to the relational structures consisting of a domain of sentences, the lexicon, and a set of reason relations on that domain. The formal representation of reason relations I'm using in specifying vocabularies is a set of pairs of sets of sentences, interpreted as the good implications relating premise sets of sentences to conclusion sets of sentences. Then we can see both the bilateral normative pragmatic theory and the truthmaker modal mereological semantic theory as offering explanatory accounts of reason relations, and hence of vocabularies in this sense, even as we're pointed to a broader model in which the things that stand in reason relations are thought of not as sentences, but as propositions in fine sense of pairs of sets of objective states satisfying exclusivity. In the next two lectures, I'll explore and exploit these newly precise concepts of reason relations and vocabulary. In particular, I'll investigate the notion of conceptual content as consisting in the functional role some bearer, sentential or otherwise, plays with respect to the reason relations in a vocabulary. Already we should be able to see how focusing on reason relations illuminates what pragmatic and semantic theories owe to each other, the criteria of adequacy they set for each other. The global isomorphism between suitably tweaked versions of Fine's truthmaker representational semantics and our deontically two-sorted version of Restall and Ripley's bilateral normative pragmatics supplies an answer to a question that Fine's framework by itself does not. For it begins to tell us what practitioners must do, how they must use expressions in order to confer on them the conceptual contents that Fine assigns them in terms of truth makers and falsity makers, up to isomorphism of reason relations. To associate verifiers and falsifiers with expressions as their semantic interpretants, practitioners must use those expressions according to the bilateral pragmatics, distinguishing in practice between constellations of commitments to accept and reject claimables that are normatively in bounds and those that are normatively out of bounds. And that includes expecting anyone who's precluded from being jointly entitled to the doxastic commitments that they've undertaken, practically to acknowledge the obligation to alter those commitments so as to repair the situation and find their way back in bounds. It's important that the isomorphism, and so the correspondence between representings and representeds, is specified to begin with not at the level of linguistic sentences and worldly facts, but at the higher level of reason relations. This is the very top of the hierarchy that Sellers describes Kant as having arrived at by inverting the traditional bottom-up order of explanation. That is, on the linguistic side, the isomorphism is at the level of meaning, not of truth. The common structure we've discerned doesn't depend on what anyone is actually doxastically committed to on the pragmatic side of representings, nor on what states are actual on the semantic side of represented reality. It's not the basis for a correspondence theory of truth. Rather, the sort of conceptual realism it underwrites is a transcendental presupposition of the possibility of correspondence theories of truth. One reason the possibility of understanding representation at the level, as I'm recommending it, at the level of reason relations, one reason that idea hasn't been sufficiently developed and explored, I think, is that people have not been working with a sufficiently developed pragmatics. Another is an insufficient appreciation of the lessons taught by the history of the concept of representation. For this reason, it's worth standing back a bit and looking at how the isomorphism between pragmatics and semantics at the level of reason relations illuminates the specifically representational semantic dimension of discursive practice. The concept of representation is a distinctively modern one, essentially due to Descartes. The classical philosophical tradition understood the relation between appearance and reality, in that sense, mind and world, on the model of resemblance, whose paradigm is the relation between a picture and what's pictured. The idea is that a picture or idea resembles its object and so is veridical insofar as it shares visual properties of shape or color with it. And it's a misleading appearance insofar as it does not, in that sense, resemble what it pictures, doesn't share properties with what it pictures. Descartes saw that this model begins to break down when it's applied to the new theories, to the theories of the new science of his time. Copernicus claimed that the reality behind the appearance of a stationary Earth and a sun revolving around it is a rotating Earth and a stationary sun. Any resemblances there run the wrong way. And it gets worse. The appearances Galileo found most veridical and so useful for reasoning about physical reality have periods of time appearing as lengths of lines and accelerations as the areas of triangles. What properties are shared there to underwrite any kind of a resemblance? And in the case of Descartes' own analytic geometry, the relation between the equations x squared plus y squared equals 1 and x plus y equals 1 on the one hand, and the circle and line they geometrically determine on the other is certainly not one of resemblance in any traditional sense. The equations just don't look like the figures at all. Descartes sees that a more abstract concept of representation is required to handle these cases, since the more intuitive notion of resemblance ceases to be useful just when it's most urgently needed, namely, for him, in explaining the sense in which the new science offers a better, more veridical appearance of physical reality than common sense did. Descartes did not, however, go on to offer a useful account of this more general and abstract relation of representation. He took it to be essentially a brute fact that the world consists of two kinds of things: representings, which are by nature tanquam rem, of or about things, and extended things, which are merely represented or representable. Spinoza, whose first book was on Descartes, figured out the most basic features of the concept of representation that was implicit in the motivating paradigm of analytic geometry. The key is that, as he put it in his Ethics, the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. He saw that equations can represent geometrical figures because the whole system of equations is isomorphic to the whole system of geometric figures. With, for instance, the simultaneous solution of equations, x squared plus y squared equals 1 and x plus y equals 1, as corresponding to the simultaneous solution of equations corresponding to the intersections of lines. That's why algebraically manipulating equations is intelligible as reasoning about geometrical figures. Given the global isomorphism, the order and connection of linear strings of symbols that's the same as the order and connection of extended plane figures, the equation x squared plus y squared equals 1 can play the same functional role in the world of equations that the circle it thereby counts as representing plays in the world of geometrical figures, with simultaneous solutions algebraically playing the role of geometrical intersection of lines. According to this story, the resemblance model was not wrong to take sharing of properties to be essential to the ofness invoked by talk of appearances of material reality. Its mistake, the source of its expressive limitations, was to restrict attention to local properties conceived atomistically. That is, properties, elements of picturings and of what's pictured could have regardless of what properties other systematic relations had. Spinoza saw that the wider scope of the new representational model is due to the holistic character of its appeal to global isomorphisms, which make visible functional correlations between items in the two systems that might have quite different atomistic material properties. The new, more abstract and expressively powerful representational model of the intentional nexus between appearance and reality develops the older, more concrete resemblance model by shifting attention to the larger relational structures whose individual elements can be understood to play the functional roles of representing and represented in virtue of the global isomorphism between the whole structures. Representings and representeds are still understood to share properties, but properties of a new functional kind, intelligible only globally and holistically, that is, relationally, in terms of relations to other representings or to other representeds, depending on which side of the isomorphism we're on. Spinoza elaborated this functionalist, holist conception of the representational relations between mind and world in a rationalist spirit. For him, the abstract systematic order and connection that is common to the two poles of the intentional nexus consists of rational relations, just as our isomorphism is at the level of reason relations. With the recollective wisdom of hindsight, we can see that Spinoza was hobbled in developing his rational holist insight by two connected mistakes, both of which Kant would rectify. First, Spinoza still followed the Aristotelian tradition of thinking about the items that most proximally stand in representational relations to one another as particulars, thoughts and things, for him, finite modes of substance, rather than as subjective judgings and objective judgeables, that is, propositionally contentful things. Second, Spinoza failed to appreciate the distinctive normative character of the order and connection of ideas. This is the Kantian thought that applying concepts or ideas in judging is undertaking a kind of commitment, something the judger is responsible for, something that can stand in entitlement relations of licensing and prohibition to other commitments. Spinoza thought of the relations making up the order and connection common to thoughts and things in terms of necessity. And he understood necessity in alethic modal terms and found its paradigm in lawful regularities of the sort natural science was beginning to codify. By contrast, Kant uses the term necessary, notwendig, to mean governed by a rule. And in addition to government by rules in the alethic modal sense of laws of nature, he acknowledged practical necessities, where deontic normative rules become normatively binding only when endorsed by autonomous agents. I mention these mighty dead philosophers both to provide context for and to emphasize some radical features of the conception I've been articulating. The fundamental structural identity between features of the use of linguistic expressions and their objective correlates is at the level of reason relations, of implications and incompatibilities, not of sentences and facts, nor of terms and predicates and particulars and their relations. Declarative sentences and worldly propositions are correlated just insofar as they play the same role with respect to reason relations. The roles with respect to reason relations shared by the sentences used to make assertions and the worldly propositions they express are conceptually articulated by the reason relations they stand in to others of their kind. This is a kind of conceptual realism, in that conceptual contents are to be found on both sides of the intentional nexus, in the world as well as in the practices of linguistic communities. This distinctive sort of realism is made possible by a non-psychological conception of the conceptual as consisting in role with respect to reason relations. According to this conceptual realism, worldly propositions, as pairs of sets of states that meet the modal exclusivity condition, can themselves be bearers of conceptual content by standing to one another in relations of implication and incompatibility. In this sense, the objective world would have been conceptually structured by relations of necessitation or consequence and incompatibility, even if there had never been talkers and thinkers to reason according to those relations. Okay. Sorry. Okay, sorry. The roles with respect to reason relations that are shareable between items caught up in discursive practices of claiming and defending and challenging claims on the one hand, and constellations of worldly states on the other, can be thought of as rational forms in a recognizably neo-Aristotelian sense. They're rational forms precisely in being roles things play in structures of reason relations. They are essentially modal forms, for both explanations essentially appeal to a notion of preclusion, the impropriety or out of boundness of a collection of concomitant commitments, or the impossibility of a state resulting from the fusion of other states. In both cases, consequence is a matter of a kind of necessitation and incompatibility of a kind of exclusion. The isomorphism shows that the modal relations can correspond exactly. But the kinds of modality involved in the pragmatics of representing and the metaphysics of representeds in the semantics are systematically different. The modality that articulates the reason relations implicit in the use of declarative sentences is a deontic normative modality, while that articulating the reason relations implicit in the modalized mereological universe of states is an olethic modality. On the pragmatic side of claimings, the claim that the coin is made of copper is materially incompatible with the claim that the coin is an electrical insulator. The modal ruling out involved in this kind of incompatibility is normative. One cannot be entitled to commitment to accept both these claimables. It's possible to undertake those commitments, but it's not appropriate or correct. The state consisting of the coins being made of copper and the state consisting of the coins being an electrical insulator are incompatible in the different olethic modal sense that the combination of them that is their metaphysical fusion is impossible. No state that is both the coin being copper and the coin being electrical insulator is possible. Both the order and connection of ideas and the order and connection of things consist of modally robust reason relations. In the one case, deontic normative, and in the other case, olethic modal. The view I'm recommending is accordingly a bimodal conceptual realism. Although the early modern philosophical tradition I've sketched culminates in a top-down order of explanation, it never fully came to terms with the holism about conceptual contents that was implicit in that tradition. And it didn't because of the impoverished conception of relations bequeathed to it by Aristotelian and scholastic logic. Substances and their individual modes are foundational for Descartes and Spinoza. Leibniz denies the reality of relations entirely, treating them as well-founded phenomena emergent from the coordination of monadic perspectives. Even Kant treats relations as transcendentally ideal, understanding all relations as the products of the synthetic activities of the transcendental subject, operating on the diverse manifold of particular representings delivered by the senses. I think Hegel was the first to pursue the radical top-down holistic program of understanding both the ideas and things that stand in the relations that articulate Spinoza's order and connection of ideas and order and connection of things. Hegel was the first one to understand that, to understand those things relationally as constituted by the reason relations they stood in. He took his romantic predecessor's dominant metaphor of organic unity as anticipating this insight, while he took it that they misunderstood its essentially conceptual character. The question of whether such a holistic ontological conception is ultimately so much as intelligible has been with us ever since. In my third lecture, I'll discuss how a top-down, relations-first order of understanding of propositional conceptual content in terms of reason relations can be worked out in detail. Well, that's my story for today. My principal concern in this lecture has been to introduce the concept of reason relations, of implication and incompatibility, along with the closely related concept of a vocabulary, which is just a lexicon of sentence together with of sentences or other bearers together with a set of reason relations among them. To do that, I pursued a stereoscopic triangulation strategy, comparing and contrasting how implication and incompatibility can be characterized first in a bilateral, pragmatic metavocabulary, expressing what interlocutors are doing in using declarative sentences to make claims and challenge and defend them, with how they show up in a truth maker semantic metavocabulary, expressing what interlocutors are saying, the propositions they're expressing by engaging in discursive practice. Appealing to a result due to Ulf Lobel, I showed how to define reason relations isomorphically in the bilateral pragmatics and truth maker semantics. The isomorphism both secures a common abstract topic and underwrites a recognizably representational relation at the level of reason relations, connecting the norms governing challenging and defending doxastic commitments by giving reasons for and against them to modally robust relations of consequence and incompatibility among worldly propositions. My next lecture addresses two related topics: the structure of reason relations in general and the relation of distinctively logical relations of consequence and inconsistency to reason relations in general. The first question is, what are the minimal structural conditions on reason relations that are compatible with the concordance between use and meaning, given definite content by the fundamental isomorphism of pragmatically and semantically specified reason relations? We can approach the issue of the ultimate structure of reasons by investigating how robust the isomorphism we're using to pick out reason relations is under variations in their structure. The second question for my next lecture is, what are the relations between reasons and logic? Here, I'll offer an account of logical vocabulary as distinguished by its characteristic expressive role of making reason relations explicit. This expressivist account sets criteria of adequacy for an ideal logical vocabulary. An ideal logical vocabulary should have the expressive power to make explicit any and all reason relations, whatever their structure. Again, reporting results from my book with Ulf, I'll present a logic that can be shown to maximally satisfy this expressive ideal. The third lecture completes the investigation of reason relations by presenting a pure model theoretic semantics of the propositional conceptual roles that are expressed by sentences as defined solely by reason relations, independently of whether we understand those reason relations as specified in a pragmatic deontic normative or in objective alethic modal terms. I'll then survey the virtues of that implication space semantics for arbitrary vocabularies, including massively substructural ones, beginning with a sound and complete semantics for the logic that I introduced in the second lecture. My overall aim is to use the very spare and simple representation of reason relations in vocabularies to illuminate discursiveness from a number of perspectives. To begin with, pragmatics and representational semantics, and then from the point of view of logic, and finally, an implication space semantics of pure conceptual roles. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And some time for questions. I can start off with one myself. So I was thinking about the isomorphism relation between um, Restall and Ripley's pragmatics and Kitbind's semantics. So I was wondering if you could say something more about how, on the one hand, how surprising or revelatory you find that it is, and how dependent it is on those specific theories. Because I take it to, I'm under the impression that you take it to have sort of quite general significance. And I thus infer that it's not very dependent on the specifics of those two theories.
Well, first of all, I find it an astonishing result that one should be able in this way to identify a common structure between ways the world could be and our talking about it uh, at the level of reason relations. This was not something we set out to look for. It was a result that popped up when we saw that our inferentialist program required a better worked out pragmatic theory than people normally have. And came to, I don't know, a transliteration really of the Restall-Ripley account of implication that they introduced to make sense of multi-succedent sequent calculus, to make sense of the turnstile multi-succedent sequent calculus, saying that gamma implies a set delta in case commitment to accept everything in gamma and commitment to reject everything in delta is out of bounds. We sort of transliterated that into the idiom of making it, into the pragmatic idiom of making it explicit of commitments and entitlements. I think the isomorphism is actually tied pretty closely to these two stories. At least on the pragmatic side, I don't see a way of telling a story that includes acceptance and rejection, reasons for, reasons against, challenging and defending. I think all those elements are going to be necessary in the pragmatics to make sense of the practices as conferring reason relations of implication and incompatibility. Now, how sensitive is this on the semantic side? There are lots of different ways of doing the metaphysics that are compatible with this isomorphism. In particular, the isomorphism is to Fein's semantics only up to the level of reason relations. There's a lot more to his metaphysics than that. Fein is completely comfortable with the idea of different states that play exactly the same role in reason relations. That's not a notion we can make any sense of with respect to this isomorphism. Indeed, no differences among mereological states that don't correspond to differences in the role those states play in the implications and incompatibilities of propositions that they show up as truth makers and false makers for. No such distinction among states is recoverable, is intelligible from our point of view. Fein is going to have to tell a metaphysical story that's independently motivated from his semantics about those. What matters for the semantics, in our understanding, is just the reason relations. Now, in my third lecture, I will introduce a semantics of that assigns sentences conceptual roles as roles with respect to reason relations that's more abstract than truthmaker semantics, that uses the notion of reason relations that's common to the truthmaker semantics and the bilateral normative pragmatics, which doesn't distinguish semantic interpretants any more finely than their role in reason relations. That's the way we think you should really do semantics, is in implication spaces. And we see Fein as interesting in that he connects that sort of abstract semantics with the kind of metaphysics he likes, which we don't have views about. We're not in that line of work. So On the semantic side, I can say sort of exactly how general the account needs to be. Uh, you need to be able to go back and forth from whatever semantic account you have to an implication space representation of the conceptual roles of sentences. On the pragmatic side, I think the pragmatics is going to have to look pretty much like what we're showing in order to see an isomorphism like this.
Okay. Any other questions?
Um, Hello, Professor Brandom. I have a question regarding the relation between, on the one hand, you said the isomorphism between pragmatic and semantic ways of construing reason relations, and that's like the technical side. And on the other hand, your bimodal conceptual realism on the metaphysical side. Do you think that the existence of such an isomorphism forces upon us such a Hegelian style conceptual realism, or do you think that a kind of Kantian transcendental idealist can also account for such an isomorphism?
Yeah, I mean, very good question. Kant is a paradigm of a conceptual realist who thinks that the natural world that we act in and know about is fully conceptually structured. Um, Transcendental idealism is a theory about how that could be. It's because we conceptually structured it, we in some large sense. I emphasized that a non-psychological conception of the conceptual that sees it just as a matter of articulation by reason relations can avoid the subjective dependence that is what's objectionable about Kant's version of conceptual realism. But I absolutely think that conceptual realism can be motivated independently. That's how I was reading Spinoza. Here, I think it is true of Leibniz as well. For my money, Hegel was the first one who straightened out these big kinks in thinking about it. But I endorsed bimodal conceptual realism in my Locke lectures of 2008, long before I dreamed of this isomorphism. This isomorphism implements a view that I think is motivatable quite independently. And I say specifically bimodal conceptual realism that sees incompatibilities and implications as objective features of the world, as well as structuring our thought about it. That's an idea that's been with us for a long time. There's a Platonic version of it, there's an Aristotelian version of it, and so on. The bimodal version, that is distinctively recent, I think, and it was astonishing to me when Ulf proudly brought me this isomorphism and said, see, you were right about the conceptual realism. And I said, yeah, we should write a book.
Thank you.
More questions?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I have a question about why you are only considering declarative sentences in this story, because pragmatics include also imperatives or inquisitives. Do you think a similar story can be told with other types of sentences?
Yeah, good question. I'm a declarativist in that I think making and denying claims is downtown in discursive practice, and that imperatives, for instance, and interrogatives and so on are essentially dependent on there being claimings and claimables in the language. So, for instance, if we look at the slab Sprachspiel at the beginning of Wittgenstein's investigations, he is careful to call the speech acts of the builder calls. Oof, he says. There's a noise that the builder makes that means bring me a slab. It's not an imperative. An imperative is a noise you make, the appropriate response to which is to bring a slab. But it's not an imperative unless it does that by saying what an appropriate response is. Yeah. Bringing me a slab, it says that. You have to be able to say the door is closed in order to say close the door, because saying close the door is doing something the pragmatic significance of which is appropriately responded to by closing the door. Yes, but it's doing that by saying what the appropriate response is, making the door closed. So I see imperatives as essentially parasitic on, dependent on declaratives, assertions. And of course, there's lots of things to do with claims besides give reasons for and against them. But all the other things you can do with them depend on the content that they get, because you can use them as to give and ask for reasons. So Wittgenstein notoriously said, language does not have a downtown. It's all suburbs, just different connections at the same level. I disagree with that. I think that language does have a downtown, and its practices of making claims, challenging and defending them, giving and asking for reasons.
Trying to get one.
So one more question.
Frank, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay, can you hear?
Yeah.
Thank you for an excellent lecture. Question, please. I'll put it this way. What more are propositional contents then than the functional relations in which they stand in our discursive practices of giving and asking for reasons? Do we need them to be more? And if so, for what purpose? What I get from you is, look, relations. That's what counts. So clear enough, I hope?
Yes. So it's essential, though what I'm most concerned to do is to explore the structure of reason, the structure of reason relations, and to see what roles things can play with respect to reason relations. That's the level at which I think sort of most fundamentally philosophers in particular should be working at. That's the level that corresponds near enough to Aristotelian rational forms as the things we should be thinking about. But it's essential to those rational forms that they can be embodied in practices of giving and asking for reasons on the one hand, and that they can articulate ways the world can actually be on the other hand. That is, that reason relations can be specified in normative pragmatic metavocabularies and alethic modal semantic metavocabularies. That's essential to them being reason relations of the sort that could confer genuine conceptual content. It's also essential, I think, that they can be characterized by logical metavocabularies and by abstract implication space semantic metavocabularies. Indeed, I'll claim by the end of the third lecture that our best grip on reason relations is from a higher level, from thinking of these different meta languages in which we can specify reason relations and seeing why reason relations have to be specifiable in all these different ways. So to understand the way in which pragmatics answers to semantics, we need to see how facts about what actually follows from what and what's incompatible with what can exert normative pressure on our practices. set normative standards for the correctness of moves that we make, on the one hand. And on the other hand, how by accepting as appropriate some challenges and some defenses, by making the claims that we do, by taking or treating some things to follow from other things and to be incompatible with other things, how we get in touch with the reason relations that are ultimately setting the normative standards for our practices. So I think the fact that we can go back and forth between these two settings, between these two kinds of explanation of what implication means, which will eventually ascend to a more abstract conception of, but these are all essential to them being reason relations.
Thank you so much. Any final question? Then let's thank Ms. Brandom